For most bead crochet projects, you'll be stringing all of your beads onto a single spool of thread, maybe even some extra, and using that spool to the very end. But there are definitely times when you're going to need to join a new strand into your already existing tube. And one of those we saw in the previous video, and that is if you have a stringing error that is messing up your pattern and that is a complicated fix, you may need to cut your thread and fix the error and join a new strand. You also may end up having to add beads if you don't string enough. In that case, there's an easier way than joining a new strand of thread. What you're going to want to do in that case is pull a bunch of thread off of your spool, enough to finish the bracelet. For a small seed bead bracelet, an inch per bead is plenty. And then once you've got plenty of thread free, at the end of that batch of thread, you take your scissors, you cut it off so that you can string from the other end. And now you string your beads, remembering to string them in the reverse order, right? Because you're stringing from the opposite end that you normally would. Another situation in which you might want to join a new strand, even if you have no mistakes at all, is if you're making something much longer than a bracelet. So if you're making a long necklace, even if you actually can fit all of your beads onto one spool, you probably won't want to because it will be too difficult to manage. So you're going to want to put some of them on a second or maybe even a third spool, or in this case, batch of yarn. Now normally you would use the same color as you were using in the rest of your crochet, but for the sake of this demo video so that you can see it better, I'm using a different color. So our new strand is on blue yarn. And the beads on the blue yarn pick up the pattern exactly where it leaves off on the white yarn. So now we have 2 beads left on the old yarn. I'm going to bring them a little bit closer, and then I will bring over the end of the blue strand to join it in. We're going to want to arrange these so that the working yarn on the blue and on the white go in the same direction. Right, so here we are. I have the working yarn for both colors tailing off to the left. And once again, you want to leave kind of a long tail. You can always cut. You can't join back on. Okay, so with the 2 yarns held together, we're going to start making the next stitch. That's going to be the orange into orange. And this is always a little bit awkward with the 2 yarns because the blue yarn isn't anchored yet. But we're pushing the orange bead back. We're bringing the orange bead down. It will, of course, only be on the white yarn, the old yarn. And now, and this is the first point where we really need the 2 yarns together, we're going to wrap them both around the crochet hook back to front and pull them through both loops as though it were a single strand of yarn. Right? So now we've completed the stitch, and you can see we now have a double loop, 1 loop of each of the 2 strands of yarn held together. Okay, so that's our first stitch of those last 2 stitches, and now we just do the next stitch. So again, I'm going to pull the red bead down. Once again, it is only on the white yarn, right? Hold the 2 yarns together and make another stitch. It's a little bit easier this time because the blue yarn is now anchored, so you don't have to fuss so much to hold it into place. Now we push the red bead back, we wrap both yarns around, and we pull them through the 2 loops. One is a double loop from the previous stitch, and now we finished the beads on the old yarn. So now we're ready to start pulling from the new yarn, and we're going to make 1 more stitch with the 2 yarns held together, just to make sure that everything's anchored well. So now the beads are only coming down on the new blue yarn, and our next stitch is this purple bead, so we'll bring the purple bead down, right? Purple bead goes back, new purple bead comes down on the new yarn. We hold both yarns together, we wrap them around the crochet hook front to back, and we pull them through both loops. And at this point, with the blue yarn well anchored, we are done with the old yarn. So we're ready, if this hasn't been done already, to cut off the white yarn. And once again, better to leave a little bit more yarn because we can always cut more off later. And so now we are going to be crocheting just with the blue yarn. Now you see how I'm tucking this white yarn back? We're from now on going to be hiding the old yarn into the middle of the tube. So I'm pulling it back so that it's behind all of the beads. And now I'm just going to stitch with the blue yarn as normal. So we're bringing down a blue bead to stitch into the next blue bead. We make the stitch, and now you can see there's just the blue yarn on the crochet hook. We're now entirely onto the new strand. And so from now on, the stitches are going to look the same as if we were just crocheting normally. So the other thing that's going to happen, and you can see it's right after this orange bead, is that we're going to run into the beginning tail of the new yarn, the blue yarn. So we're going to also tuck that back inside the tube, right? Now, depending on where it's sitting, you might find that you need to sort of use a needle, but in this case, just that tug, I think, has gotten it hidden away pretty well. And so from this point out, as we crochet, we're just going to crochet our tube up around those two tails, so the two tails are hidden inside the tube out of sight. And now that is the join accomplished. And if you take a look here, you'll see in this it is somewhat conspicuous, but that's because we're using yarn, which is a little bit thicker. You'll probably be doing this with thread and seed beads, and of course 2 different colors. So when you do this with the same color and thread, not that visible, right? So now you're going to crochet around these 2 tails, either until they run out, or if you lose patience, when you've got 2 or 3 inches well secured, then you can cut them off. And proceed as normal. So that's not the only way to join new yarn, but it's a way that I particularly like, so I hope you find it helpful.